turn to a slightly different aspect of this, the colonial side of this. We've been focusing on the kind of monarchy and war in Europe. Let's turn now to some things that are going on as the empires of these various countries are expanding. Again, with the understanding, of course, that a lot of these empires are expanding with a view of this is a part of their Christian duty, often with a view of missionizing, spreading the Christian message, in addition to gaining commodities, gaining power, gaining land. In the Reformation period, of course, we predominantly focused on the Spanish, talked about some things that they were doing. We could have spent some time talking about the Portuguese as well. But since the 1500s, there were more nations getting involved in colonization. Of course, you have the Spanish and the Portuguese, but in the 1600s, you begin to have the English, the French, and the Dutch. Now, late in the 15th century, the Pope had released a papal bull that essentially had split the Americas between the Spanish and the Portuguese, which is why you have, for example, in South America, a lot of those countries on the western side speaking Spanish, but then you have Brazil, which speaks Portuguese. Well, that has to do with where the line was, where it was on this side is the Portuguese can control, on that side the Spanish control. Not surprisingly, the English, the French, and the Dutch, who were excluded from this, ignored it. Right? They just go about doing whatever they want to do. So let's look at a couple of those, specifically the French and the Dutch and the English, since we talked about the Spanish already. Colonization by the French was relatively small in the 1500s, but really began developing in the 17th century, often with the support of the church in France. In 1624, for example, the Cardinal Armand de Richelieu becomes very important advisor to the king. And a lot of his focus is predominantly on European power struggles. And Gonzalez really talks about that in the chapter on France. But he's also very instrumental in helping establish institutions that would help the growing numbers of colonists, predominantly in Canada. And Canada is the main place where the French are going in the Americas. Certainly there are other places they're going. That's why Louisiana has the Cajun population that it eventually will have. But Canada is the prime focus in a lot of those early years. In 1663, Louis XIV will make Canada a royal domain, and so he's paying much more attention to France's colonies and begins a relationship with them that really benefits France. The trading, other types of things economically. The French Empire never got huge. The French eventually do start sending some priests, in addition to the traders, the governmental officials, other people that are there for that. One of the primary groups to go to French colonies are French Jesuits. And in many respects, we can kind of contrast the approach of the French Jesuits to those Spanish Franciscans we looked at during the Reformation period. If you think back to what we talked about with the Spanish Franciscans, a lot of the approach to the Spanish Franciscans, to natives, was we gather them all up, we bring them to the missions. There they will adopt European dress, they will adopt European language, other aspects of European culture, and we'll make them Spanish. Slightly different approach for the French Jesuits. The French Jesuits, especially New France, Canada, became much more about learning the languages of the natives. We're talking about groups like the Iroquois, the Huron, right? Some other groups there in eastern Canada. And so they're embedding themselves in those tribes. Additionally, the French Jesuits appear to be coming with less of that economic motive that was so much a part of the conquistadors and their relationship with the Franciscans. The French are less tied to the Pope than the Spanish. The Spanish were very closely tied to the Vatican. And they start their conquest, they start their colonization a lot later than Spain. Additionally, it's different because the French are not coming with the same size military force as the Spanish do. So they don't have the soldiers that can force natives to do the things that the priests want them to do. So instead, the Jesuits kind of see themselves as guests of the Native Americans. Additionally, there's a slightly different approach to how they are going about their mission. With the Franciscans, there was a lot of emphasis on asceticism, right? Living that very simple lifestyle, austere lifestyle. It was a lot about favoring youth. The Jesuits were more about things like obedience, right? It's a kind of soldier mindset. They were also emphasized discipline and education. Certainly the Franciscans educated natives to some extent, but the Jesuits were much more about that in their missionary impulse. They were also quite different when it came to their approach of how do you go about converting Native Americans. For the Jesuits, and the Franciscans as well, baptism was very important. Right? This was the moment where you became part of the church. And so one of the things that was focused on was counting converts. And so the Jesuits would send reports home to France about the number of people they baptized. And they're counting all sorts of people. They're counting, children. They're counting people that want to be baptized on their deathbed. And they're writing back. These documents have been preserved. They're known as the Jesuit Relations, and there's several volumes of these Jesuit priests describing their experiences in New France. But of course, when we ask, they're talking about these sizable numbers of children being baptized, a sizable number in some of these villages being baptized. We kind of have to ask the question that the Jesuits really don't discuss. When they're being baptized, what are they doing? Quite possibly, it's not always because they're accepting the truth of Catholicism or the truth of Christianity. It might be because they think of it as a healing ritual, and so that's why people on their deathbed or people that are sick are approaching the Jesuits for baptism. Right? All of the traditional means have been expired, nothing's happened, so maybe this ritual washing will help. So there isn't that interior conversion to Catholicism as much as it is looking for spiritual power, maybe. Certainly there are indications of people who did accept Catholicism and did accept Christianity. But quite often it was probably more about some sort of perceived power that people thought they would get out of baptism rather than a full-scale approach or full-scale acceptance of the truth. The Jesuits were also known and practiced generosity. Again, with that mindset of making that reciprocal relationship with the natives. I'm giving to you, now you give back to me. Pay attention to what I have to say, listen to what I have to say. The Jesuit priests that went to New France were often martyred in huge numbers. And their stories become very well known in France. And because they were very graphic, some of the things that happened to those that were captured. When the Jesuits come, there's a lot of intertribal warfare between the Iroquois and the Huron, and the Jesuits get caught up in that and find themselves as captives, tortured to death like other Native American prisoners were as well. And so, they're committed to that. The other thing about the Jesuit approach to conversion that's important is they tend to focus on persuasion rather than the use of force like the Franciscans in New Spain. Now, a lot of it, of course, is they don't have the sizable military force that they can use like the Spanish did. And so they have to approach it differently. They still, of course, think of the Native American traditions as demonic. They're coming from the devil, so it's not like they are approving of their traditions. But there is that difference of They're not looking to destroy Native Americans. They're not looking to destroy Native American culture. They're just trying to find a way to communicate and share the Christian message. Don't want to deny, of course, there's a lot of force, there's a lot of non-Christian attitudes that those missionaries have. But they're definitely taking a different approach rather than the Spanish Franciscans are. Questions about the French colonial enterprise? Anything we need to explain a little bit more clearly? Don't have much to say about the Dutch. From a Christian standpoint, I mean, there are probably a lot of other things we could say if we were just looking at history. But from a Christian standpoint, there's not a whole lot to say. The Dutch also started their colonization in the 17th century, mostly in what was known as New Netherland, eventually becomes New York, the transition occurring because the English take over New Netherland. Within a couple decades after starting, they are largely out of the colonization scene due to mismanagement of resources, poor decision-making, and eventually a lot of Dutch land ends up in English control. The Dutch Reformed Church, the state church of the Netherlands, never becomes very strong in the colonies, largely because the Dutch are not immigrating as much as some of the other colonies. When you think about the growth within the English colonies, the number of people that are coming because of things like religious freedom, in Maryland, eventually in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and there's a lot of English colonists coming for a variety of reasons, including religious freedom. In the Netherlands, there was religious freedom. So there wasn't that impulse of people trying to find places where they could worship freely. There isn't the same kind of economic draw for a lot of people as there was in some of these other places. And so the Dutch really don't have too much of a sizable impact, but it does reflect, they try to establish the Reformed Church, but it doesn't really go off as well. Which brings us to the English. Already today we've talked about some of the colonization efforts under specific rulers. We'll talk more about Puritanism here on Wednesday, and talk about things like Quakerism, the Baptist Church, and other things as related to colonialism and spread. But there are a couple of things that I do want to say about Puritan New England right now. Specifically in thinking about the interactions that Puritans and natives had as more Puritans are heading to the New World. Again, focusing on this kind of political aspect. Probably most of us, if you grew up in the American school system, and the school system in the United States, whether private or public, you've probably heard the story of Massasoit and the Pilgrim's first Thanksgiving. And this very kind of moment of good feeling and the ways the Native Americans helped out the Pilgrims for that first winter, and the celebration of we made it through the year, even though sizable numbers of the Pilgrims died. Great. However, it doesn't stay that way, largely because the group of Pilgrims we're talking about is relatively small. And so in those early years, there are those better relationships that quickly deteriorate as more and more English come to the colonies, especially with Massachusetts Bay beginning in the 1630s. And this develops in a variety of what are known as Indian Wars. One of the first major ones occurs in the late 1630s with the Pequot. The Pequot find themselves being very poorly treated by the Puritans, and the Puritans begin taking a lot of their territory, often without trying to make any sort of financial arrangements. A lot of the treaties that are made, the natives don't understand what they're agreeing to, and eventually it gets to this breaking point, and the Pequot have had enough. And so they're beginning to do raids, miniature types of things of aggression. In 1637, Puritans attack a Pequot fort supposedly in retaliation for the death of two individuals who were actually killed by Naiadics, not Pequots. But it appears that the Puritans didn't really try to make that distinction, and so they attacked the Pequots. The Puritan leaders, in kind of an interesting way of justification, justified their actions toward Native Americans through comparisons with Israel's conquering of Canaan. And so a lot of those Puritans saw themselves as reenacting the conquest of the land. And so they see themselves as Israel on an exodus from England, from the great Pharaoh, James, or Charles, right, whichever group it is, right? And now they are conquering the land. And so a lot of Puritan writings talk about this kind of, as the Israelites conquered Canaan, that's what we're doing. Also referring to natives as the Amalekites, who Israel was required to wipe out from existence. So this is the language that they're using. Right? God wants them to completely remove the savages from the land. 4 decades later, in the 1670s, another conflict, another sizable battle would break out. This coming from Algonquins. They found themselves kind of pressed between the Iroquois territory on the one side and the Puritans on the other, and they're kind of getting squeezed in the middle. And so eventually a coalition is formed with other decimated tribes, including the remnants of the Pequot, who didn't really come out of the Pequot War too successfully. And their leadership is under a man named Metacom, who is the son of Massasoit. Right? So within a couple decades, even though Massasoit helps the Pilgrims, here's Metacom leading this coalition. The English don't call him Metacom, they refer to him as Philip. And since he's the chief, it's King Philip. So in 1675, Metacom burns English settlements, takes captives, kills hundreds of colonists as an attempt to kind of, retake some of this area. Ultimately, the Puritans interpret this as this is God's judgment on them because they have not remained faithful. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about Puritanism on Wednesday. And so they see this as, God is judging them because of this. Ultimately, the English win King Philip's War, but they also lost as well. It cost a sizable amount of money to achieve victory. And on average, every English family lost at least one close relative. So there's sizable death on the Puritan side as well. 52 towns were badly burned, 13 were totally destroyed. And so there's a sizable impact, and of course, the impact on Native Americans as well. The last aspect of politics that I want us to focus on today, and I might actually, we should be able to finish it today. If not, we'll finish it on Wednesday, has to do with some of the developments related to slavery. Now, there's not much that we can say about slavery in the 17th century because of the lack of records and lack of information. We'll be able to say a lot more about the experience of enslaved Africans in the 18th century and certainly in the 19th century. But slavery, of course, becomes a very important aspect of the colonial enterprise. But we're not just doing this in history class, we're talking about Christianity. And Christianity is very much entangled with all of this. And these early stages of this will set a foundation for a lot of things where we might look back and say, how could Christians have fought that kind of thing? How could Christians have justified holding people in bondage? Well, here's where a lot of that begins. The seafaring slave trade appears to have begun in 1441. Slave trade between Africa and Europe. Slavery, of course, has been around for millennia. With a Muslim woman brought from Africa to Portugal. So that's kind of the first earliest record we have. It's from the 15th century. During the 1500s, Portugal and Spain forcibly transported millions of Africans to South America and the Caribbean. The first slave in North America, especially in the English colonies, is usually dated from 1619. So 1619 is kind of the date of slavery in English colonies. Europeans had been involved in the trade for a century or more when we get to the 17th century, when it really starts to explode. Now, in some respects, it's important to recognize that part of the reason the slave trade really was able to take off was that slave trade was already a part of African culture prior to the arrival of Europeans. Internal slavery and slave trading eventually, though, become this kind of external slave trading. You're trading, instead of just within a tribe or between tribes, you're now trading with Europeans. And so as the economic possibilities of slavery opened up, Africans in power were often very interested in participating with Europeans. And so, you know, there is a part of African society that is complicit in the slave trade. In Africa, slaves were very important as a symbol of your wealth. There really wasn't private land ownership in Africa. Basically, you had the rights to products produced on land. And so if you had slaves, you could produce more on the land, which would gain you wealth. So the more slaves you had, the wealthier you were, because you didn't own the land. Essentially, there's kind of a difference here as far as how Africans and Europeans are looking at it. For Africans, slaves were a sign of status. But essentially, slaves were peasant cultivators. Their job was trying to cultivate the land. For Europe, the slave trade becomes about doing the work that nobody else would do, and kind of forcing people to do work that wouldn't be accomplished otherwise. And so this structure made it easy for Europeans to tap into it. Many of the early slaves tended to come from those that had been taken in warfare and who hadn't been able to find a place in their new communities. And so we took these slaves in warfare, we're willing to sell them to you. But toward the end of the 17th century, there is an explosion of the number of people that are involved in slave trade, and then becomes even greater in the 18th century. And so the numbers increase during the 17th century. The other thing that increases by the time we hit the 18th century is how much Europeans are willing to pay for slaves. And so the price for slaves goes up as well. As people are enslaved and brought to the Americas, especially in the 17th century, they come to work, to serve, and also to bolster the developing American economies. During the 17th century and into the 18th century, colonial society is gradually transforming as economics of production and the development of cash crops made owning slaves a better economic decision. With the development of things first like tobacco and then indigo and rice, it became an economic decision of, well, if I can grow more of this, if I have more people harvesting this, I can gain a lot more money, and so slavery becomes an economic decision. By the end of the 18th century, of course, cotton will be included in that. But it's not until the development of the cotton gin that slaves are really used in a sizable way for cotton. As these slaves are coming, they are bringing with them a lot of their own language, their own culture, their own religion. There is a sizable group of Muslims that appears to have been enslaved. Estimates for the entirety of the slave trade, even in the 19th century, estimate somewhere between 15 to 20% of those enslaved were Muslims. Many slaves also would have been familiar to some extent with Christianity. In the 17th century, though, there weren't too many efforts, especially in the English colonies, to convert African slaves on a sizable scale in any sort of united way. It's only after European colonialists increase and people start asking this question about, how does this fit in with Christianity? Now, we talked about with Spain, Native American slavery. But Native Americans as slaves didn't work out that well. It was they were able to more easily escape and hide because they knew the areas, right? And so they could escape detection, which Africans were not able to do. Native Americans declined in numbers rapidly because of the devastation from European diseases, and they were not used to the types of work that slave owners were putting them towards. When it comes to thinking about slavery and Christianity, there's a lot more that we'll begin to talk about in the 1700s and the 1800s as people start to question the compatibility of Christianity and slavery, and others will try to justify slavery through Christianity. But in the 17th century, there's a lot of incongruity and hypocrisy. So, for example, we talked about Bartolomé de las Casas and his negative views of Native American slavery. But he doesn't appear to have been opposed to slavery in general. He certainly makes no discussion about African slavery. But when we think about the Middle Passage, right, that slave route by the late 6th century on, there are terrible conditions for Africans. They packed as many slaves as possible into these ships. There was disease, there was death. Yet there isn't this massive outcry in those early years of how can we as Christians treat other human beings as well. In some areas imported slaves from both sexes and encouraged slave families. Depending on which power was in control, the slaves might be married according to the church's rituals, especially if it was a Catholic power. In other cases, that wasn't as much a concern. And so there's that incongruity as well. We'll pick up on Wednesday with a couple last things about the beginning of African and slave Christianity, and then we'll all move into some of the cultural changes that are occurring in the 17th century and how that's having an impact on Christianity.